height and weight. We can see those things just by looking at people. You can look at me, you don't know what my ferritin level is, you don't know about my CRP level, but you can say, well, what is he, 182, 83, BMI, 26, 27 perhaps, 26, please. So these are things that have been around for a long time, but they're not just the stuff of Hello magazine. We can use them in far more sophisticated ways. So height, once you're grown up, your height is a relatively stable thing over adulthood. You start growing maybe at the extremes 21, 22, some people much earlier, but after that, once you get to 22, your height stays pretty constant. Once you get very old, you might shrink a little bit as your intervertebral discs start to compress and you get some bone changes as well. This happens during the day. You get up after a night's sleep, you start to compress, you're a bit shorter in the evening than you are in the morning. But on the whole, height is a fairly stable measurement across adulthood. It doesn't change. But height is a product of childhood growth. And this growth is influenced by inherited characteristics, genetics, and by childhood exposures. So actually childhood exposures make quite a difference in both growth rate, but also in fully attained height. The height you get to at the end when you're an adult. So this is why adult height can tell us, sometimes, not necessarily always, but often can tell us about some aspects of childhood circumstances. So somebody very disadvantaged may end up being a shorter adult than you would expect based on their genetic potential. So, growth. When we talk about height, perhaps what we're really interested in is not height itself, but growth. How we got there, the things that influence the development. Why do paediatricians, why do and school nurses measure childhood height with such regularity? Because it tells you about other aspects of development. If bad things are happening to you, this can influence growth and height, and therefore also the other things, other parts of development, cognitive function, development of the central nervous system. These are all also potentially affected by the things that influence growth and height. So this is why it's often used. That's why we have growth charts to tell us indirectly about other aspects of a child's health as they develop. All sorts of things can influence growth and the development of central nervous system and other body systems. Nutrition, of course, is important. Most children now in developed countries have enough in the way of calories, but there are other aspects that can influence growth. Malabsorption can be a problem. So you have enough food, but your gastrointestinal tract is unable to absorb it. This might be because there is inflammation there, an inflammatory process. For example, because of inflammatory bowel disease, which is relatively rare, or celiac disease, which is caused by an immune response against gluten. It destroys the villi, these little processes that come out from the surface of your intestine to increase the surface area and to absorb nutrients. So if you have celiac disease, what happens is you get villus atrophy. These little villi are destroyed by inflammation. The surface area is very much reduced, so you don't absorb as much nutrients as you would, and this can have influences for growth. So it can be picked up by changes in the trajectory of your growth chart, and of course it has adverse consequences for the development of other systems too. So growth, as I said, is a childhood phenomenon. One stops growing at the most by age 22 years. But it starts off obviously from conception. You start growing in utero, you get bored, you keep growing, and then you start perhaps as young as 16, but then possibly continue. It's not a linear process. In other words, you don't grow by the same amount every year. We grow in fits and starts. We have spurts. There's a spurt before age 5 when you grow much faster. Then there's a period of linear growth between 5 and 9 perhaps. And then around puberty, of course, lots of things change, including your growth velocity. There's another spurt there. Girls tend to have that spurt at an earlier age than boys. But what can delay growth? What can slow it? Well, there are inherited factors, of course, but exposures can influence your growth rate. This can happen at different ages. If we think about periods of susceptibility, there are things that can happen when a woman is pregnant that influence the fetal growth rate. But then the child is born and it can catch up. It's not going to be a small baby forever. It's not going to be a small human forever. This is why some people can keep growing for longer. So things can happen that slow growth during childhood, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be terribly short as adults because they keep growing for longer. Although it does usually cast a shadow, so people who have had these adverse events in childhood do tend to end up as somewhat shorter adults, but looking at growth is much more sensitive, and you can identify the processes much more clearly if you can by using growth rather than final attained height. The problem is, of course, we don't always have that measure of growth, whereas with adults we always have their height. Okay. So as I was saying, height or growth. We know that tall adult stature is a marker of all sorts of good things. Tall adults tend to have better qualifications, they tend to have lower blood pressure, they have a lower risk of unemployment, they tend to have better jobs. So is this because it's been argued people who are tall are more oppressive? They can persuade you, they can persuade an employer to pay them more, not to sack them. But if this were the case, why is it that height at age 7 is more predictive of all of these things than fully attained adult height? Why should your height when you're a child tell you about your risk of unemployment, your risk of high blood pressure as an adult, more so than adult height? What this is telling you is that it's not the height itself. What's happening is there are exposures in childhood that slow your growth rate, and they have influences in the central nervous system, in the development of personality, and in other areas, and in cognitive function, possibly social consequences. They may inhibit your ability to pursue education, living in unfavourable circumstances. And so this also influences height, but in a way the growth and the final attained height is an epiphenomenon. It's the things that are influencing growth also influence things like blood pressure control. So being short itself as an adult isn't a risk for high blood pressure, and it's been argued that it is. Some people have said, maybe 20 years ago, that being short means the pipes are short. It's a question of plumbing. The blood doesn't have to be pumped as far, therefore the pressure is higher. But if that were true, you would expect adult height to be more important than childhood height, and it isn't. So its influences on the growth are also influences on blood pressure control mechanisms. Of course, as children grow, weight and height are interrelated. It's not, you can't look at them entirely separately. If somebody is malnourished, they'll of course be very thin, very light, they won't have much weight, and they won't be growing well either. People who have an excessive number of calories will have a higher body mass index or be fatter, and they'll have more free energy for growth. So you may see the spurt into puberty happening at a slightly younger age because of this free energy that's provided by this huge calorific or higher calorific intake associated with a higher BMI. So what controls growth? Well, it's a complex process I'm not going to go into in huge detail. There are lots of things that influence the growth rate, energy availability, how much you can have to eat, for example. An important component of this set of pathways is growth hormone, which you'll hear mentioned perhaps. Growth hormone, the biological systems like to, they're complex, but they like to reuse things. So growth hormone doesn't just influence growth, it has other metabolic and even immunological effects. Growth hormone isn't the only thing that influences growth as well. If you're looking at little babies and fetuses, Insulin-like growth factors are more important than growth hormone. So these are complex processes, a number of hormones involved, but growth hormone is important, very important, certainly throughout childhood and adolescence. Secreted by the pituitary gland, regulated by the hypothalamus, these parts of the brain. There are other hormones involved. As I say, it's a complex process, including growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Now, growth hormone secretion generally occurs during deep sleep, non-rapid eye movement sleep. And so when your grandmother says to you, if you don't go to bed, you won't grow up to be big and tall, it's absolutely true, because you do have to sleep. So things that disrupt sleep will influence growth. But other things will influence growth hormone secretion. It varies by sex, of course by age, diet, exercise. Stress can have a profound effect if it's chronic stress. And of course the interplay of other hormones, because these are complex networks. So what are the sorts of things that influence growth hormone production? Well, nutrition, but calorific intake is seldom an issue in healthy children in developed countries. Sleep disruption, as I said, is important. It can have an effect. You see that children who share a room when they're small, who share a bed, even worse, tend to grow more slowly. Stress has been clearly shown to have an effect. The first paper on this was in the early 1950s. Widowson was looking at orphans in Germany, and it was a randomized trial of bread and jam and concentrated orange juice. And so this study was looking at the effects, the beneficial effects on growth of giving children bread and jam. Nutritional supplement, because food was scarce. This was in post-war Germany. But what they didn't take into account, and couldn't, was the matron in this orphanage, or one of the matrons, was rather nasty. And she moved between orphanages, but they couldn't understand why. In some orphanages, when they introduced the bread and jam, they saw that children weren't growing as well. It was nothing to do probably with the bread and jam, but this rather nasty matron who was there, she was responsible, because they were comparing different orphanages, so the orphanage she was in always did badly compared with the others. So the explanation given was that it was rather stressful to have this nasty woman looking after you, unexpected rows and so on. So that was one of the first papers showing that chronic stress can have an influence on growth. And we know that's a marker of other things like cognitive development too. So it's a marker of risk of different types. Mel and I have done some work on this, looking at family conflict at home, where the parents are arguing and leaving each other, seeing that children who live under those circumstances are more likely to grow slowly. There are more extreme examples of children who have very high levels of stress, something disastrous happening at home, and their growth stops altogether. Psychosocial dwarfism, this has been called. And what you see is, if you take those children away from those very stressful circumstances, take them into hospital, for example, or a safe place, you see after about 2 weeks, growth hormone production begins again. It's almost been stopped, but then it begins again, and the children start to grow again. So these are some of the things that can influence growth hormone production. Growth, we know that genetics are important for height. People with tall parents are more likely to be tall than people with short parents. But it's not all genetics. Of course, we know there are quite significant temporal trends in height. So over the last 150 years, people in developed countries have been getting taller and taller and taller. It's quite interesting if we move people between countries, because we think of Japanese people, Noriko, as quite small, don't we, often? But in fact, Japanese people who have grown up in America, whose parents have moved to America and have had a baby there, have grown up, same genetically, because they have two Japanese parents, but then they're as tall as the American population, if not taller. So clearly there's something going on in Japan which influences height influences growth that's not just genetic. Perhaps you could give us some insights into this later, Narika. Why is it? What is it that's happening in Japan that's stopping people growing? You don't have to tell us now. Now, I say offspring tend to have heights similar to their parents. This is why you'll sometimes see, probably less so now, mid-parental height used as an approximation of how tall somebody is going to be. But this isn't a simple thing to look at genetically, because a very large number of genes contribute a small influence to growth and height. At least 100 genes. It's much more than that. Now, I've lost count. I'd stopped counting at 100. So 100, 200. Okay, Mina's saying thousands, and it probably is thousands. I suppose it depends where you take your threshold of magnitude of effect. But this is the same for lots of things like polygenic diseases. With multiple sclerosis, we're up to 260 now, each one, with an odds ratio of 1.2, 1.3, those sorts of effects.
1.3 is amazing.
Oh, I know, 1.3 is amazing. Yeah, no, 1.3 is amazing, usually it's 1.1. 1.1. Okay, so that was genetics. Despite that, there are some conditions in which single genes can be important. Androchondroplasia accounts for approximately 70% of dwarfism, so people who are short, so it's not that common. It's not 70% of the population, but 70% of people with dwarfism. That's impaired limb growth and some skull distortion. They have restricted growth hormone production. And there's it produces another form of height restriction if you have restricted growth hormone production, So this works in a different way. So it's a mutation in fibroblast growth receptor 3 gene. So this is an inhibitory gene, so it inhibits bone growth. So this isn't like restricted growth hormone production. It works in a different way. It restricts bone growth. So this is an autosomal disorder, which means it's not sex-linked. It's a dominant disorder due to a faulty gene in the genome. So it's unfortunate if you inherit this. You inherit it from your parents. It can be a result of a spontaneous mutation because it's more likely if your parent, if the conception was after age 35 years. So mutation risk goes up as you age. But this is an exception. But it's always good just to slip in the odd exception. This is a single gene disease or condition. So weight. We've done height, now we do weight. It's another measure of growth, except outwards rather than upwards, I suppose. Birth weight, for example, in babies, newborn babies, is more often used than recumbent length. So, both things are measured, the length of the baby and how heavy it is. But when we think about how healthy the fetus has been, we tend to think much more about birth weight than length. So little babies, when they're born, tend to catch up, or they have a period of catch-up growth. They'll grow faster afterwards. Weight is a combination of everything, obviously, of bone, of blood, organs, bladder and gut contents. A couple of kilograms of bacteria and other bits and pieces in your gut, that includes, which is quite a weight to carry around when you think about it, isn't it? Why are we interested in weight? Well, when we're thinking about birth weight, we're thinking about healthy development. But in adulthood, we're often thinking about weight as an indicator of the amount of adipose tissue, of something unhealthy, of fat. And what we're particularly interested, I suppose, in that unhealthy sense is visceral fat, the fat around your middle. And that's often what we're trying to get at with BMI in adulthood. So the thing about weight is, you have to standardize it. Because a short person and a tall person who weigh the same would be telling you something quite different. Babies are much the same ones, so you don't have to worry about that in terms of birth weight. But for adults, it's more of an issue. And so what we usually do is standardize it using body mass index, BMI, which is just your mass, your weight, standardized for your height. So you divide it by height squared in meters. And this works fine for adults. For children of some ages, this can be more problematic because body proportions differ. If you look at a baby, the head takes up about, I don't know, half the body almost, but then as we grow, the head gets relatively smaller and smaller, and you can see that change in proportion, and that's the reason, one of the reasons why BMI doesn't work at some ages, but it works best for adults. So what can you do? I mean, there are a number of possibilities, and I don't think there is an absolute rule of what to do. There are the formulae that people use, like height cubed instead of height squared. You can use BMI and age standardize it, which is what I prefer to do. So I just use BMI all the time, but say BMI amongst 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and so on. Nothing's perfect. Okay, so here is just typical BMI ranges. So you can think about very severe underweight, BMI less than 15. For underweight, this is less than 18.5. Normal, 18.5 to 25. Overweight, 25, and so on. And you see these very extreme classes of obesity over 40, which, you know, are quite recent. It's quite recent, at least in Sweden, to see these. You know, I work with historical data in Sweden, looking at people who were born in the 50s. When they were young adults, there was almost nobody even in the obese category. And certainly there was nobody at all in the severely or very severely obese categories. That's not the case now. You know, younger people are coming along, so we're seeing this temporal trend in the tendency to obesity. You can't always use BMI as a continuous measure, because depending what you're doing with it. For example, we were doing some work on stress and its association with BMI. So stress in childhood was associated with unhealthy weight gain, but also in other people with unhealthy weight loss. So, you know, some slight differences in susceptibility or exposure might mean, you know, the outcome goes in different directions. So I'm always unhappy when people use BMI as a linear measure and just give average BMI associated with an exposure, because that doesn't take into account this possibility that exposures can affect both ends. Unhappy people can end up being overweight or underweight. So it can be inconsistent. And this has to be remembered. I tend not to use it as a linear measure. These categories aren't fixed. They tend to vary by time and population. As I say, earlier in the century, in the last century rather, it was very unusual, at least in Sweden, to have these very obese classes. Now they're much more common. It's the same in Britain. We see the new normal in terms of the distribution in the population as overweight. Overweight is more common now than normal weight. So it depends what your viewpoint is, whether you're looking at BMI as to what is normal. The associations with mortality are quite striking. This was some work we were doing quite recently amongst young adults. And so you can see, again, both extremes are bad. So this is BMI going from very low to extremely high. This is a line drawn through the actual data, which we would have ended about there and there. But what you can see is, if you're very underweight, it's extreme. Your mortality, the risk of death, is very high indeed. Quite often underweight is the highest risk group. It's telling you about people with cancer, with wasting diseases, and very susceptible people to a number of risks. Whereas at the other side we see this steady increase with increasing BMI, increasing mortality as well. So this is a good indication of why you can't use BMI as a linear measure, because you can see there are risks for outcomes as well at both ends. So any other problems with BMI? Well, what's it actually measuring? It's just height standardized for weight. But the thing is, if you're really interested in fat, it's not getting at that, because BMI can't differentiate between muscle and fat mass. this is a particular problem for the overweight category, 25 to 30. Somebody who is extremely muscular can have a high BMI, or relatively high, so you would classify them as overweight, but actually they're overweight, or they're in that category, because they've got big muscles. And BMI can't tell you that. What else can you do to try and get around this? Well, you can use other measures. You can look at waist circumference, because that's going to get at central adiposity. And you might refine that even further by looking at the ratio of waist to hip, which again is getting at that central adiposity, this marker of fat around your middle. So how else can you measure fat adiposity? Calipers, so these things which measure skin folds. Bioelectrical impedance, because muscle and fat have different levels of impedance. You can use dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, which is DEXA for short, which we usually say, or MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Now, quite often you see impedance measurements, bioelectrical impedance, but this is not a gold standard. It's not an absolute. If you really want to do it, you do have to use something like MRI, which for us tends to be too expensive to use on a regular basis. We might use it for assessing accuracy. So it's a rough and ready measure if you just use BMI, and even if you look at bioelectrical impedance, it's not perfect. So these things are approximations. There's always going to be error, but this is how it is with any epidemiology. There's no perfect measure. We just have to be realistic about the level of error or precision. So, this visceral adiposity we've been talking about, it's not just like a tub of lard. It's cells. And these cells contain fat, but you can think of it as an endocrine organ, because each of these cells has receptors, and they can influence production of peptides and cytokines. So they can have an influence on production of hormones, and an influence on things like inflammation, your tendency to your pro-inflammatory tendency. So the endocrine and immune systems can interact through the HP axis and through other means. So actually, this isn't the point I want to make is this is not an inert mass fat. It has a biological effect, both in terms of the endocrine system and the immunological system. It can influence cortisone, a mediator of inflammation, and this is very important. This idea that an important driver of inflammation is excessive visceral adiposity, and so inflammation, even at quite low levels, can have effects. It's a bit like having a fire which is burning slightly. It can flare up. And the thing is, once inflammation starts, it tends to propagate. So you have an environment where it's possible for inflammation to propagate. So inflammation in another system, because of this systemic inflammation, means that the inflammation caused by something else may be worse, and it may continue for longer. It's more likely to become chronic inflammation. So obesity has implications for your metabolism. So this central adiposity again. When you're stressed, your brain requires more energy. And so you get this suppression of insulin production or secretion, which allows the brain to be provided with more glucose, which has been called brain pull, to allow your brain to have more energy when it needs it. And you get a reduction in this with people who are obese. So people who are obese are less able to engage this brain pull, to bring energy to the brain quickly when it needs it during times of stress. And this has implications, for example, in the response to cerebral ischemia. If the brain is starved of oxygen, if you have a stroke, if you have a subarachnoid hemorrhage, What would happen in a lean person would be there would be a greater ability to bring more energy to the brain so that it could be repaired. So you might expect people who are obese to have more severe strokes because there is less capacity to repair the damage. And actually we've seen that recently. We've just published a paper showing that people with obesity tend to have more severe strokes and be at greater risk of strokes as well. But there's a paradox. People who are obese also seem to have lower stress reactivity, and in some cases they seem to have a lower risk for cardiovascular disease. We see that the overweight people being healthier than the normal weight people, particularly older ages. So it's not entirely straightforward. So when we look at older ages and we look at weight loss, actually what we would think in younger ages as a healthy and a good thing, at older ages it looks like it's hazardous. People who are overweight may be at lower risk of adverse outcomes, mortality associated with COPD, for example. And one of the signs that things are going wrong is when people start to lose weight at older ages. So it can be a signal of something, a risk weight loss at older ages.